to the cloud. So there were a few questions that got sent David's way, kind of as a way of preparing for this time, with the understanding that David would peruse those and at least have a place to begin the conversation about these first three chapters, from exile to Cuernavaca to Illich's take on church. So it's a rich territory, and I'm deeply curious about where the conversation will take us. With that, over to you, David.
Thank you, Marcus. Greetings to Jens and to Larry and to Justin. There were more than a few questions, and they indicated, amongst other things, that there are a number of you who have read these three chapters very, very attentively. So it put me in something of a predicament. There's no possible way I could answer all of them, but it seems almost beside the point to give a précis of what's in those chapters. But I see no alternative but to say something to begin, and then let the questions be re-asked by people as they're pertinent. I can't summarize them really, except to say they definitely converge by and large on church in various forms. What is the church today, I would say, is the focus of those questions, and what has Illich to say about it. But so let me go back to the beginning. I mean, the book, after giving a very short sketch of Illich's early life, begins with a chapter called Exile, and his experience of exile began, I presume, in childhood, when he left Split, Dalmatia, Spalatoy, the island of Brach, for Vienna, where evidently, at least in his personal mythos, I don't quite know how to say it, never identified with the bourgeois Vienna in which he actually grew up, in Grandpapa's astonishing Art Nouveau mansion in a section of Vienna. And so he was an exile already. He was a fatherless boy. When they were forced out of Vienna in 1941-42, he, I think, was already conscious. He told me, this is in Illich in Conversation, I'm sure it's repeated in the book, that he knew at the age of 12 that he would not have children, that he was departing from his line in a certain way, that he was going into exile, and that his life ever afterwards was lived in tents, in temporary accommodations, except with the partial exception of Puerto Rico, where he said he felt surprisingly at home during the 4 to 5 years that he lived there. So exile was his condition, which, as I say in the book, goes in a certain way with the Christian condition and the biblical condition, in as much as Abraham's journey begins with an exile. So the important experience, I think, is the Puerto Rican community in New York, and Illich realizing that these displaced people are his people, and then going and traveling in Puerto Rico and getting interested in the style of Christian celebration that he found there, and picturing this kind of the Church of the Incarnation, where he was an assistant priest, is a forbidding, not unlike many other churches, structure. And he had a great feeling for the Puerto Ricans confronting this forbidding structure, having come from informal outdoor chapels by and large. So he became a champion of the Puerto Ricans. And I think already in those years, in the early 1950s, you can see the two aspects that will be so important in his thinking and in his character, which is that he is a priest who impresses his parishioners by the depth and sincerity of his devotion, by the fervor with which he celebrates Mass. This was the recollection of Joe Fitzpatrick, who was a Jesuit professor at Fordham and who became Ivan's dear, dear friend, lovely man, and also accomplice. But that's what he remembered, that people loved the way he exercised his priesthood. But he was at the same time constantly organizing, and one of his another assistant curate told Francine Duplessis Gray, when she wrote the profile of Ivan for the New Yorker in 1970, called The Rules of the Game, that it was like riding in a Piper Cub with the bomb under the seat. So he was, it's just a great image, right? Now you can imagine what an event he must have been in this New York parish, right? He just, as an assistant priest, and yet you could see this, this was going to be a major happening. So it was a major happening, and he ended up in Puerto Rico. He won the friendship of Cardinal Spellman, which is quite a story in itself. I don't know if that part of Catholic history is known to many, but Spellman was an old style Catholic politician, and a man who 10 years later would bless the bombers that were flying missions over Vietnam. I mean, he was a rock-ribbed character in that sense, but Ivan won his admiration and his undying loyalty, and Ivan only lasted in the church until 1967, 68, because he was under Spellman's protection, and that was a formidable protection. Anyway, Spellman made him a Monsignor. He was Archbishop of New York, and sent him to Puerto Rico, and that's where the mission piece, the piece in the book that's called Cuernavaca, because that's where it ended up going, begins. He started his first institute there. He discovered the astonishing likeness between the burgeoning school system of Puerto Rico and the Roman Catholic Church there. And he began to develop the philosophy of mission that's laid out in a book that's, I don't know how easy it is to find now. It's called The Church, Change and Development. It has a number of long pieces on mission that are not in Celebration of Awareness. It surely is still in some libraries. It should probably be republished, and I hope it will be, because not all those articles are in The Powerless Church, which was a reissue of some of his early writings by the Penn State Press in a book in the same series as mine. So in those writings on mission, he reveals a pretty radical and yet also very consonant with Christian tradition philosophy, in which he speaks of the church as a sign that has to be made manifest in a new cultural context. So he definitely, he doesn't think of mission as the bringing of any definite dogmatic datum. It's the learning of what that comes with the missioner, but what it will be in the new context has yet to emerge. It will emerge, and it will always emerge according to Illich, as a surprise. So it was pretty radical compared to a position in which mission is just the bringing of some news that you possess and others don't possess it yet, but you're going to share it with them. It was not that at all. And my great teacher on this point is probably Simone Weil, who in the first and last notebooks, there's a passage on the resurrection that has always been crucially important for me, where she really essentially asks for tact about how could the gospel be preached in such a way that the resurrection doesn't overshadow the crucifixion. And what she says really is that the resurrection is a doctrine that has to be treated with the utmost tact. And instead, it was taken as a sign by the early Christians, according to her, of triumph, and of a triumph so absolute that all that would be necessary would be to outline, to define the system of pedagogy by which the rest of the world would be brought on board, in effect. And that seems to be the kind of philosophy of mission that Ivan was trying to combat. So he wasn't sympathetic to Simone Weil. I never knew really why. On one famous occasion, his dear friend Lee Hoynatsky loved Simone Weil, and he and I had that in common. And one day there was a book with a picture of Weil on the cover, and Ivan pushed it away and said, "She reminds me of my mother." And he never said another word on the subject, and Lee never really found out more either, but something was going on. So the philosophy of mission was outlined there and then put into effect, really, through the Center for Intercultural Formation, which grew up to be the Center for Intercultural Documentation in Cuernavaca, which by the end of Ivan, I should also say, although I'm sure you all read this, that he was thrown off the island of Puerto Rico by the bishop, who was in a position to do that when he intervened in the election of 1959, I think it was. The two bishops on the island wanted to prescribe and to campaign against the party of the then president of Puerto Rico, that birth control should be sold in drugstores. And Ivan intervened against them and was ordered off the island. So that was how they got to Cuernavaca. One other thing that happened in Puerto Rico that's always been very, very important to me in understanding him, and it's a story also I've told, but I'll tell it again. He came to the view, and this also answers questions that were asked about liberation theology. He came to the view that when he was in the position he was in, which was vice rector at the Catholic University in Ponce in Puerto Rico, that he was essentially in a political position, and that therefore he should not in any way exercise his priesthood, on the theory that the priest is an alter Christus, another Christ, acting in that place. And therefore he bought a little, he went to a little fishing village remote from the university, and a place where he felt that had no connection whatever to the university, and they might not even be aware that there was a university. And there he would celebrate Mass for the fishermen, which he liked to do. He had a little hut where he would do it. So that separation very early on is crucial. He's a highly political man. He's willing to take on the bishop. He's willing to intervene in the election, but he insists that Eucharistic celebration must be entirely removed from the political sphere, and that any exercise of priesthood must also be entirely removed from the political sphere. So Cuernavaca, I think I needn't tell the story. I'd like to say one more thing about the philosophy of mission, because the first major book to appear in English, it was published by Oxford, was by an historian called Todd Harch, and he called it The Prophet of Cuernavaca. And there Harch, at the time he wrote the book, was a convert to Catholicism. And he took it upon himself to spank Illich for his disobedience to 3 popes, and to pronounce that Illich had made a crucial blunder in his attack on the missionary activities of the church. And he also criticized Illich for writing what he took to be a veiled theology. I think he's wrong on all counts, but it's the mission point that I want to say. I think that Ivan never doubted that every Christian is a missionary. He said that in one of his earliest essays that he wrote for a little journal in New York while he was a priest there. And I don't think he ever doubted it, but he took on the initiative to Latin America, which was fomented from the mid-50s on by a Maryknoll priest called John Considine, and which was endorsed by 3 popes, and which eventually became an order, in effect, that the American church should send fully 10% of its strength, its personnel, to Latin America as missionaries, which Illich felt would potentially overwhelm the Latin church. It would shore it up against change, and it would export, because of the way he felt American Catholicism felt about itself, it would export a cultural Christianity that would overwhelm indigenous Christianities in Latin America. He didn't believe finally that there was an indigenous Christianity as it should have been, in his opinion, in Latin America. Like, that is, a really native American church never took shape. But still, there were many interesting local developments within Latin American Christianity that he felt was threatened. So I think he was always sympathetic to missionary activity, and I always admired genuine, in his opinion, missionaries. But he was but the school in Cuernavaca was pretty tough on a lot of people that he felt should not be going to Latin America, and he didn't hesitate to subvert that part of it, and that eventually came to a head in 1967 when an article written for the Jesuit Journal America called "The Seamy Side of Charity" was distributed by his accomplices at a big meeting organized by Cardinal Cushing in Boston, and it was an out and out. I mean, it was a very strong, satirical, pointed article, and of course it put the wind up everybody. And it was the next year that he was summoned to Rome and subjected to what amounted to formal processes of inquisition. This again bears on some of the questions that were asked. He would never talk about it. He did share thank God, with Francine Duplessis Gray what had gone on in Rome, and in that article of hers called "The Rules of the Game," which was in the New Yorker and then subsequently in a book she published. So we have his account through her of what went on. He left Rome after a day. made to answer questions in a questionnaire that was highly tendentious, let's say. Some of the questions are reprinted in the book, so you'll have seen them. And he eventually concluded that he couldn't possibly answer those questions, that it would be wrong to answer them. And he was dismissed the next day by Cardinal Sieper. And I think an incident we may have talked about last time, when he said, as he was walking away, he recognized the words that the Grand Inquisitor in Dostoevsky's fable addresses to the Christ. And get going and don't come back. It was his recollection of what Cardinal Sieper said to him. So the next year, a ban was placed on the center in Cuernavaca, and that was when he decided to write to his new archbishop, Spellman having died at the end of 1967, and withdraw from the exercise of his priesthood. So that's a very important point. I think that he suspended his official duties as a priest, and pretty scrupulously, I think he did that. But of course, it remains an open question whether he then began to exercise a new kind of priesthood. But he, in the events of 1969, he shows himself again to be of this double character. Right? He's quite shrewd. He manages the situation quite politically, and at the same time, he's absolutely scrupulous on certain points. And I think, was entirely innocent of any wrongdoing or any heterodoxy as they found against him. So we can talk much more about his philosophy of the church. I think the other thing that's in, pardon me. I think the other thing that's interesting, and this comes out in the essays in Celebration of Awareness, and it comes out even better in certain of the writings that were published in The Powerless Church, this volume that I mentioned that kicked off the series from the Penn State Press, in which my book appears. And these were essays that he had asked that they be published after his death. Some of them had been published, but there were some that hadn't, and there were a couple that I found that he hadn't included in that list, which I think are very revealing, such as the one called "How Shall We Pass on Christianity?" But it's plain that he is imagining something that at least is connected, since Jens mentioned Bonhoeffer, that something that at least is connected to Bonhoeffer's concept of a religionless Christianity, in the sense that he believes that something that the church has, since it took on, at least since the time that it took on welfare functions in the late Roman Empire, has finally, in his time, in that exact time, reached a point where it's really no longer needed in the seculum at all. That it doesn't have to, that it can slough off the burden of being a service institution and become purely a celebration of faith. So that is there's a definite new age element in that faith in the 1960s, I think, with him. And he is quite explicit. There's in the the book The Powerless Church, there's a transcription. It's not a text that he ever finished, but of a conference he gave sometime in the later 60s to a group of psychiatrists that appears, in which he is quite explicit about how he understands what is left, in a way, what is indispensable in the church, and he calls it faith. He says that is the one thing that remains to the church, but when it ceases the exercise of all these social control or welfare functions that it has taken on throughout its history, what it remains is a vehicle of faith and celebration. So probably the most explicit statement of this new age attitude, I hope you don't mind me calling it that. Obviously the term has a color, and yet it does have a millennial element to it. I think it's a paper that he prepared with two others at the time of the March on the Pentagon in 1967, and it leads off the book Celebration of Awareness, and it really is proclaiming a new age, and that carries over, I think, into the work of the 1970s, in the sense that they're peppered through all those essays, but perhaps diminishing, is the conviction that something is imminently going to happen. So in deschooling society, you get the idea that deschooling is imminent. It can't be resisted much longer. It must occur. Medical nemesis begins with a prediction of a major house cleaning in the health professions. Tools for Conviviality is explicitly a statement of now or never, laying out what he calls the conditions for recovery, but at the same time making a remarkable number of predictions of essentially technocratic nightmare. If these a world, an artificial creation, he says, totally enclosed in an artificial creation. It's a phrase that Wayne picked up in one of his questions. The predictions are really quite frightening to read. So I think those all bear on this idea of a moment, a possible turning point appearing to him at that time, and in which he was fully invested, threw himself into it with an energy that is hard to believe in retrospect, when just his travel schedule alone, lecturing here, there was like 2 lectures in one day sometimes in different cities. It was remarkable. And I think I told the story maybe last time, when my wife Yuda and I went to see him in Vancouver in probably 75, 76. And he thought he was in Seattle, as he revealed in the course of the lecture. So he was moving pretty fast. So let me wrap this up and see if people can help me or with me expound what he thought about the church. Obviously one of the crucial things is that he wants his readers to know that he is fully a man of tradition. So that was almost the first joke he made to me when we met, that he was we rode back from the airport in 1970, and atrocious old car. He was coming to address a teach-in, and the War Measures Act had just been declared. And I, and with others of my like-minded, had been demonstrating and all up in arms about it. And I was very surprised to find that Ivan was fully approving of what Pierre Trudeau, whom he knew and had been in conversation with earlier, along with Marc Lalonde and some others of that circle, Pelletier he knew as well, that he was fully approving of what Pierre Trudeau had done in proclaiming the War Measures Act. I was a lot older before I could understand why he might think that such an excessive and superficially unjust action might, in the longer term, be a necessary and a just action. But that's what he thought. So he could see my discomfiture and my dismay to find out that my radical hero, was a reactionary throwback. And he said, well, I think a lot of people take me for a novelty act just because I'm so antique that it's imperceptible. I appear to be avant-garde because I'm so traditional. It's the kind of paradox that he loved, and it was certainly a harbinger of what John Milbank and others would later call radical orthodoxy. But he was fully traditional, attached to tradition, believed absolutely in preserving the integrity of certain rites, certain formulas, certain modes of celebration. And at the same time, he was absolutely an innovator who was willing to call his fellow clerics folkloric relics and to propose the complete declericalization of the church. And it was his insistence always that those two were one. They could only function as one. They could only live as a couple in which each referred to and was rooted in the other. A vision of two as one, which presumably is also the animating idea in Gender years later, the book that really sank his reputation as a leftist. So that couple, tradition, innovation, is the crucial one, I think, in his view of the church, and the one that was probably hardest for others to understand, that he could never really find interlocutors or anyone to dance with on that point. He had to leave finally because he realized it was fruitless. That it was just a sterile controversy that he was engaged in. That he wasn't talking to anyone. So the church that things would just get worse for the church that he loved by his continuing to fight his corner. So that was when he just simply departed. What that meant to him was a question that some asked. I know Wayne asked it. He never told me. And I think he was genuinely a man who tried to take each new conjuncture, each new set of circumstances that he encountered at its face, not dwelling in the past, not those who have read Ivan Illich in Conversation or read it carefully anyway, that's a major tension that's underneath that text, is me coming, all boned up on tools for conviviality and deschooling society, all the rest, and ready to put him through his paces and get him to sing his songs. And his trying to say, look, that's a long time. that's a long time ago now. I don't, that's written dead stuff of its time, he says. And he could, in my opinion, at times overdo that, that because he had stepped 2 paces to the left to say, well, there's nothing there. I think that's, anyone who's reading Medical Nemesis now, I think will agree that there's something there, even if there are things that he missed or elements that he added later. But he did move on. And how he moved on as a priest is a question I think we're going to discuss. He continued to see himself as a loyal son of the church. He shocked me one night in Cuernavaca. This was probably a shock comparable to the one I got in the car coming back from the airport in 1970. We were just sitting outside in the place where he lived in Ecotepec, which is a small village that had been outside Cuernavaca. It's now part of its suburbs, really, but still a distinct barrio. And I remarked that the passage in which Peter is declared to be the rock on which I will build my church. You all know it, I'm sure. What he binds in heaven, what he binds on earth will be bound in heaven, and so on. And I said that had always seemed to me an obvious interpolation in the gospel. And he said, well, I've been exposed to that way of looking at it throughout my life. He said, but for me, I take it as read. To me, it means that he foresaw. It's a joke, yes, to found your church on a rock, Peter, his name in Latin means rock. It is a joke, since he knew and predicted Peter's inconstancy. But at the same time, it's exactly what he intended to do. So he never questioned, in other words, that the church is a divine ordinance. It is the church. It is the church that Jesus founded. And as I've not myself part of that church, as I've tried to understand him over the years, one of the images that has occurred to me is that he throws up a bridge to the uttermost edge of that understanding, but never exceeds it. He stays within it. That is his view. And I think, I am outside that, and not because I'm not a Christian, but just not sharing that view with him. So he remains always part of the church, and yet what is he doing in the years afterwards? Well, he's following his nose, he's following his inspiration, he's trying to encounter each new circumstance as it appears to him. So gender and all its sequels comes out of a deeply felt and vivid encounter with feminism, and so on. He's trying to take in what he thinks is happening in the early 80s, when he begins to feel that the world has, in effect, gone over a cliff or reached a watershed in his language that he never expected in his lifetime to see, that people actually are thinking in an entirely new way. And it's almost an intuition of the post-human in a certain way. That is, it's the genesis, the seed of his idea of an age of systems. And on it go, so that leads him into thinking about the history of literacy and the whole the work that appears in the vineyard of the text. So he's constantly living at the edge, and so in that sense, each time is new. It is, you can't quite look at it as, well, you predicted this in the early 70s and now it's here, so what do you think about that? That was then. This is now. What's happening now? What are we going to do now? As far as church is concerned, my most vivid experiences of being in church, if you can say it like that, were with him. And the feeling that any place, if people are rightly disposed, can be a place of celebration, that it can happen here, it can happen now, it can happen with these ones who have come together now. And that was constantly being repeated. It happened in State College, Pennsylvania. It happened in Bremen in Germany. And it happened, I think, in many other places. So in that sense, he was a seeder of churches throughout his life. And just as Paul's churches were probably not quite what we think of as churches, these are not quite what we think of as churches either. So I don't know. At the end of the book, I tried to wrestle with this and to make a few probably pretty circumspect remarks about the possibilities in this regard. I think maybe one thing I'll say finally is that once you get you grasp what Ivan is saying about our present world as a congealed, hardened, unconscious form of church or of Christian religion. If you accept the hypothesis that modernity can be studied as an extension of church history, in his words, and then so you're not you're already in the presence of church in its perverse or congealed and having sunk down in effect into the unconscious. I don't want to get too Lacanian about it, but in a certain way you can picture it that way, as having sunk into the unconscious and as no longer being visible, but being absolutely real. Then I think it's very hard to just imagine something positive without looking also at this negative, which holds people, which holds us, which is present, and to ask about the modes in which it's present. How is its influence being exercised? How is this all happening? So the question of church, or the question of religion, is complicated in that way. Larry, Robert Inchausti, asked in his letter about Illich's limiting himself or my claiming that Illich limited himself to the occasions by which he felt called, so that he never tried to lay out an overview. I mean, that's, if my two great contrast cases in the book are Northrop Frye and René Girard, who both, beginning from an initial seed of vision, spent a lifetime patiently cultivating the field they'd been given, and in book after book, laying out the implications, thinking it through. Entirely admirable scholarly enterprises, in my opinion, and both extremely rich and fertile ones. But Ivan wasn't a thing like that. So he would write these pamphlets, but then, he would be called somewhere else. He really tried to live on the spur of the moment. And I think I said this last time, but it will astonish me till the day I die that I think what was most important to me, what is most important to me is in the Rivers North of the Future wouldn't have existed if I hadn't called for it. Hadn't called for it, received it, cherished it, passed it on. It just wouldn't have been. And it's hard for me to understand that faith still. Surely, if you know this and you believe this, and you must want to say it. So I think in the end, it shows how utterly he felt the world to be in the hands of God, not in his hands. and to sincerely, and he says that in the Ivan Illich conversation, the first interviews, he says that, I understand the world best if I think of the world as being in God's hands, as you'll see on any medieval apps. And it makes a wonderful teaser for one of my programs. But as I've thought about it over the years, I've come to see that it's true. So okay, I'm going to shut up. I hope those who asked questions will repeat which ones of them they think are germane in this context. And we can go from there. Yeah. Yikes! How long was I talking?
Proportionate to the length of your book, David.
You said right. The 560-page discourse.
Yeah.
All right.
Doorstops all the way.
All right, you take over.
There's a question already here from Jens, who had to go to a lecture. So maybe we can start there and invite others to jump in. This question says, thanks, David, and all, hugely interesting and thought-provoking. He says, I wonder what Illich might say now and how political the church might appear in holding up human rights. Has to go to class? Gratefully, Jens. So it's a tight little question that he whipped off as he had to leave the Zoom room. But I think, I hear a lot in that question in terms of there are like the questions of human rights and who speaks for them, who is on the side of human rights. These are very much political questions and have a kind of connection to the Christian heritage.
What do you think he means by human rights? Is he thinking of the pandemic civil rights issues or much more broadly?
I hesitate to guess. I don't know Jens, before meeting him today at all. I did I did learn a little bit of some of his take on German politics, which gives me a sense that he's probably more on the conservative side of the political spectrum.
Mhm.
And so I'm guessing some of what the question is about is in terms of um, when the church becomes, the the ambition to be seen as an ally is very a human rights
Okay.
ally is a very significant and political category for a lot of us now, and in some ways there is a kind of a way in which that takes on its own
Well,
religiosity, its own form, and the church connects to it in complicated ways.
well, let me try and take his question from where I am, and let me take human rights as being the right to be with my dying grandmother, um, the right to decide for myself whether I will be vaccinated, the the right to have a free speech, right, an uncensored media. Um, since I won't try to demonstrate it here, but I feel I can give good evidence that the CBC, along with other media, is now effectively censored, and that the Trusted News Initiative, as they call it, which the CBC subscribes to, which was cooked up in the summer of 2019, is basically, we will say what the public health authorities want us to say, and we won't say, and we'll call everything else misinformation, disinformation. So if that's a human rights problem, then I put much of my hope in Christians to see what's going on and to speak, and to take this on, right? And there has been in the dog's breakfast of protest we've had in Ontario, there certainly has been a strong Mennonite presence throughout. And there have been a number of pastors here and in Manitoba, I think in Alberta, who have challenged the prescription of worship, and those kind of things, right? So I continue to hope for a coming together on that score. But, so yeah, I think there's a huge role to play. Yes. But I don't know if he's also thinking of Illich's very strong distinction between, I mean, and this came up in all the questions. So this is the she-it business, right? Which is how he put it to Francine Duplessis Gray, but it's the church as a sociological reality, the church as obeying all the laws of worldly necessity, of being not in any sense free of all the necessities which the world obeys, and the church as she, which is the intimation of the kingdom, the pearl in the net, he says, in talking to Duplessis Gray. I love that image of the pearl in the net. It's found by accident, right? Just like the man who finds a precious jewel in his field and buys the farm. He finds it he comes across it. He isn't looking for it. And it's Simone Weil's contention that we can't look for it, that God will find us, but that whatever we're looking for is some predetermined image that we have, which can't, by definition, be God simply because we've predetermined it. Again, I think Illich and Weil are on the same page there, whatever the idea of his mother was. So that, I don't know if Jens is thinking, well, but doesn't this prevent a political church, a militant church, a church that takes stands? I don't think it does. I mean, I think it's just it's a form of awareness. And that's crucial for him. It's a celebration of awareness, that if you know that, you will act in a certain way. You will not necessarily, you won't be exempt from worldly necessity. But when he walked out of Vatican II because he didn't like the what he took to be the compromised or partial stand on, refusing to make an absolute stand on nuclear weapons, was his issue. I think he took political stands throughout his life. He had no hesitation in doing so from Puerto Rico onwards, but always he insisted that the mysteries must be kept.
What do you think he would have made
from
of
worldly embodiment?
What do you think he would have made of Pope Francis? I'm thinking of his recent, I don't know if it was an encyclical, but his participation in this fourth global movement. I thought of him just now because, you know, one of the things Francis does is he makes in some ways, wonderfully naive, complete denunciation of the global arms trade. He just says, just stop. In the name of God, please just stop making and selling weapons.
Well, I think he would have loved that. Now, he was pretty scathing about John Paul II. He really, I think, as he went on and as he was sort of erased in a certain way from Catholic memory, even in Laudato Si, where I would have thought maybe Ivan's voice would come back. Someone would recognize that he had been there, that he was something in contemporary Catholicism. It's never happened. He's gone from Catholic memory as far as I can see, at least so far, which is okay. So that's how it is. So I don't know. A lot of people ask me that about Francis, and I don't know how to answer that. I think his view would be he's dead now. Sufficient unto the day.
Other folks have questions stewing, I'm sure.
David, I asked you the question about what, I guess the two together is, what is the good in the church as an it? And you've alluded to that a little bit in this sort of radical traditionalism, or radical, but what is and what's the limitation in terms of the church as she? Because at a certain point it becomes so elusive that it can almost be made into anything. It becomes chameleon, not quite chameleon-like, but it's almost protean. How do you know it's the real she? And can anyone define it as they like if there's no form, there's no structure? And then is there some overlap between Martin Buber's I, thou, I, it distinction? Because Buber was always trying to see what is the good in the it, the limitations of the it. The highest is the thou, maybe Illich is she, but Buber was also acutely aware that you have to live in the world of it as well.
Well,
how do you live in this tension?
Well, the good of it is that without the church, we wouldn't have the gospel. That's what Ivan says. And I mean, I think that's true, right? So the good is the protection of the deposit of faith. And that's absolutely real for him. The idea of the evanescence of the she, well, my favorite image, it comes from a book by Wendell Berry called Jabber Crow, in which at the very end, it's the reminiscence of a barber in Wendell's fictional town. And he says at the end, I see now that this is a book about heaven. And then he uses the image of trees reflected in water. Now, that's evanescent and not evanescent. What you see in the water is everything. Yes? But it's not there. It's completely present and not present at all when you try to grasp it. It's there until you grasp it. It's there until you put a stick in the water and the image is gone. It's not there. It's there. It's not there. To me, that's what he's talking about. It's present here, but I can't touch it. I can't own it. I can't command it. It's completely beyond me, and yet it's absolutely present to me. So that's the kind of image I get. A divine bud that will flower in eternity, he says. There's a wonderful passage it's in the second half of The Rivers North of the Future, when he talks about friendship. I'm trying to discuss with him a passage in the letter of James in the New Testament. And he says that, what happens in the world any distortion is possible, right? So then you must stay with, he says, stay in the seed, stay with the seed, right? And then, we'll see. Now we see through a glass darkly. So I feel it's only elusive as it needs to be, but it's not vague, right? It's not vague. The kingdom is absolutely real and present, but as soon as you think you have it, you don't have it, which Lao Tzu says as well as Ivan Illich.
So David, I thought
so
of
there was one more of which is Buber. Ivan often mentioned Buber. I suspect that most importantly, Buber was mediated through Paulo Freire, who was deeply, deeply connected to Buber in his writings and was an important presence in Ivan's world in the 60s. So yes, I think he certainly knew Buber. He certainly knew the Ayatao, and presumably took it on board, but at the same time would speak of it in a somewhat distanced way. I think fearing that it had become a little bit kitschy, perhaps.
Yeah, David, I was just going to add something you said a few minutes ago, twigged on a quote, I think I have it somewhat accurately, from Simone Weil. Something like, the church is that great totalitarian beast with an irreducible kernel of truth. So I wonder whether Illich would have thought along those lines.
Well, I don't know. I think he might have fought shy of totalitarian beast. I think he may have. I think humor was pretty important to him, and I think discretion was pretty important to him. And so I'm thinking of when he talked about Jacques Ellul, I think he loved Ellul and respected him and gave gave a homage, a kind of laudatio for Illich at a gathering at which Illich was present in Bordeaux sometime, I think, in the early 90s. But he found him too Calvinist, he said, too. Now Ray was no Calvinist, and yet there's that exacting spirit that I think he wants more laughter, right? He wants more laughter. Yeah.
And more getting the joke. And more getting the joke, as you point out.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, that's true. That's that interesting saying where he says it's like the laughter and the joke, right? Two people hear it, one laughs. It's so beautiful, right?
Yeah, it is.
Anyway, so
Thank you.
so I Vay's maybe a little too much for him, and yet she's. Yeah.
I'd like to describe a dilemma, and maybe I'll stumble out with a question towards the end of it. You talked about, I think, with some grief about Illich's memory being erased from the Catholic story. And I find myself looking around me increasingly grieving that the memory of Jesus is being erased from the cultural memory all around me. I even think of like who I mean you David Cayley produced an interesting way of holding conversations open at the CBC that involved Christian thinkers. And I can't think of anyone who's there now who would carry that particular torch on in that space. And I find myself, as I see my daughters coming of age and sort of establishing their own identities, sort of stuck between a world where the people who talk, what's Bruce Colburn's line? The people who know don't have the words to tell, and the people who with the words don't know that well. Like Chris, in some ways, the Christian torch is being held high by people who, beat you over the head with it. Or on the kind of progressive left, there's a sort of sense of being so open to everything in the universe that we're kind of suggesting to our children that it just doesn't really matter anymore whether this story stays alive or not. And I don't know in myself if that's just something I can just sort of, the deeply radical trust that the world is in God's hands takes me to a place where it's like, ultimately, I don't even have to worry about whether anyone preaches the gospel in the next generation. It's out of my hands. But I do fret about it, and I wonder about those spaces where we do pass on Christianity and the kinds of the little churches, the odd little churches that Illich seeded. Like, are those spaces that are passing on a Christianity that has a kind of conscious connection to the gospel still, or is it his commitment to being a kind of secret agent for the holy, kind of vacate the space so fully that it's we're in a kind of saying, looking at in the back, sort of in the rearview mirror at a time where we held spaces where we told the stories and sang the songs of Jesus as a kind of core commitment of this journey that we're on, that I think Illich comes out of and still reimagines for us.
Well, I'll try to answer. The first thing that I think is true is that he gave an example, and I think, and this is a counter to Todd Hart, whom I mentioned earlier, who sees Illich as as practicing some sort of veiled theology, right? Like he's sugarcoating the pill or something. I don't see it like that at all. I see someone who is trying in the seculum of the 1970s, trying to see how the gospel will flower, how the church will emerge as a sign in this new circumstance, right? So he's trying since it's his understanding, he says this in Medical Nemesis, that faith is not in his gift. He cannot bestow it. He cannot presume it. It's clearly not present in many of his interlocutors, and yet perhaps it is, and he doesn't know it, or perhaps in Weiss terms, those who've undergone an atheist purification, as she calls it, are closer to God than many who think that they have God, that there are implicit forms of the love of God, as she says. But he doesn't judge that, I don't think. But he is trying to understand what stands in the way of a spirit of celebration, right? And what stands in the way of understanding our human condition, which for him is understood in a deeply Christian way. And so he, in one sense, he's trying to manifest without revealing, yes, without presuming, actually trying to find his way into the situation. Now, the other side of it, which you also mentioned, is he was in his class that he gave in Bremen late in his life, and he used a phrase from the Lord's Prayer, on earth as it is in heaven, whatever that is in German, and was amazed to find incomprehension in his listeners. Stopped the class, took a survey, and I think he found there were a handful only of these young people who actually recognized it. The one prayer that the Lord says is indispensable. Teach us to pray. It's the answer to the request, teach us to pray, is unknown to them. So I think he was very aware of that circumstance and presumably deeply worried about it. So again, you've got both sides, right? I'm as worried about it as I think you are, right? How's this going to go, right? When nobody, it's the Bible, which is the rock from which our civilization was hewn, and if there's no knowledge of the Bible, then we're not in that civilization anymore, right? I think increasingly we are. You've said it, right? So I think, this is just because we're talking, and because Northrop Frye had a book that I admired and learned from called The Secular Scripture. There are times, I think, when religious language goes dead on people, right? That may be the case for many people now. And to give a personal example, one of the hardest things I've had to deal with is that I find I'm almost allergic to the Gospel of John because of its anti-Semitism. because I can't stand to read any more about what the Jews did and what the Jews said, right, against this innocent Christian who had wandered amongst them. It makes me crazy, as the church often makes me crazy. And it was, I don't know if this is a story I often tell. I may have told it last time, but it was a crucial moment for me. I kept trying to rejoin the church. And when I was living in Vancouver in the early 70s, I started attending a little church near our house, and came home one day, and my wife Yuda asked me the pregnant question, how come you're always in a worse mood when you come back from church than when you go, why do you come home? If this is such a joyous thing for you, why do you come home in a worse mood than you left in? And I had to really think about that. And I thought, well, it's because I am so totally, so deeply ambivalent that I'm going to just yaw back and forth between these poles, that I'm going to be arguing, and at the same time I'm going to be moved. I'm going to be arguing and crying at the same time, in effect. That's a destiny. That's a fate that I can't avoid. So now back to Jayber Crow. One of the things I realized reading that book, which is I believe it's a Christian scripture of the first order. It's a book of astonishing beauty. When I asked Wendell Berry about it, he said, well, that one came out of nowhere. that was my gift, right? As if it wasn't like the other books. And I admire all of his books, but I find that one to be of a different order. So sometimes we're given things from surprising sources or unexpected sources, which are so the light isn't necessarily going out, is what I'm saying. If we're losing references that we think are indispensable, that we think are the ones that can't be lost, maybe they're not being lost.
This isn't picking up on what you've just said, David, but I wonder if Illich would. You alluded last time to his being sort of a jet setter St. Paul in the 60s and 70s, and I wonder if he would say something like St. Paul, be imitators of me insofar as, I've slightly added the insofar, I am of Christ. I wonder if Illich would have that sense. That goes back to something you said that twigged a while back.
Well, I suppose, yes. Yeah. I don't remember him ever asking people to imitate him, and he was, yeah, but that could well be, yes. He certainly was a great admirer of Paul and felt close to him. So.
I was going to say, David, commenting on the issue of the Bible, I'm just getting near the end of the course I'm teaching on. So first part of a two-part. This goes from classical thought up to Erasmus, and I asked the students to read from the Bible, usually a couple of books. And I had one student asked me the other day, "What is the Bible?"
That's worse than what you on face. Really?
Yeah, Paternoster, they may not know it, but not even to know the Bible.
Yeah. So there it is. That's yeah.
One of my favorite quotes about the church, I've never known who exactly the source was, but it's apparently an African proverb that goes, the church is hopeless, the church is the only hope.
Yes. So that's a very Illichian paradox, right? So who else?
I say, David, you want to comment maybe a little bit? You've sort of inched towards it. What might be the tensions? In your chapters, you touched on a bit, but between Berrigan and Illich?
Well, he was maybe a little hard on Dan Berrigan, and this, for those who don't know the story, Berrigan was essentially, Cardinal Spellman sent him to Cuernavaca to get him out of New York, and he felt in a certain way he was being locked up in the cellar for the time being, and that Illich, I think, was in a certain way Spellman's accomplice. I think Illich was ambivalent and sometimes probably harsh towards the kind of theatrical demonstration, the blood on the draft files kind of actions that the Berrigan brothers were engaged in, and also the two who came back from, I think, Guatemala. I've forgotten the names now. Another couple that he singled out as engaged in self-dramatizing and theatrical acts of protest. And he insisted to Francine Duplessis Gray that he believed in following the rules of the game. And so she called her profile of him the rules of the game. And that real revolution in his account, and this then bled into his idea of cultural or institutional revolution, was to think differently, to really remake yourself. And that was the only real influence that one could exert. So that these actions in the end were just generating a whole set of consequences. They're just setting a whole chain of retribution. It's just, he didn't believe in it, right? So now he didn't succeed by his method of sticking to his orthodoxy, his obedience. In the end, it didn't change the church any more, obviously, than Dan and Phil Berrigan's blood on the draft files changed the church. So I think maybe he was a younger man then, and I think he wasn't a kid, but he's still in his 40s, early 40s. So I think he probably changed his view as he grew older. But I think that was the tension, and maybe it was the same tension with liberation theology, right? That he really didn't think that kind of intervention could succeed and might compromise the gospel, or the church, you could also say.
So Dom Helder Camara, who would have been, I would have understood in that liberation theology kind of mix, he very much respected for all his life, I believe. I'm right, David.
Oh, yeah, he loved him. He just loved him. Yeah. But he also speaks about all the nonsense that he spouted. About nonsense about liberation and such stuff, says Ivan. But I think he thought Elder Camara was a saint. I mean, he just admired him boundlessly and loved him immeasurably, no question. But he didn't accept the liberation idea. So, paradoxes on paradoxes. Who's next?
I was thinking, David, the paradoxes and the ironies remind me a lot of Erasmus. Did you ever talk to him about Erasmus at all? Or
No, I never did. And obviously, but Erasmus's idea of folly, I think, comes close to Ivan's idea of foolishness in himself and in his Lord, since he doesn't hesitate to call Jesus a fool, the fool who was crucified, he says. So, yes, I think there's an affinity there, but I don't know. There's a lot I don't know about Ivan's formation and what he read. And, in the end, there's a lot of mysteries there.
There was
And
a
of course,
question that was stirring for me, especially when you were kind of recounting the parts of his journey where um, he's kind of going from one house to the next as he's getting the boot in some sense, and uh, I guess I'm thinking about his incredible charisma and how charisma can perhaps afford someone the ability to burn more social capital than someone with less charisma, and I wonder about people who were connected to him who maybe had to just play it a little more safely than he did for the sake of careers, whether that's in the institutional church or in the university system or wherever. Um, uh, what if there's anything of those kind of relationships with people like that would I guess what I'm wrestling with is my own sense of, boy, this guy's a hard act to follow, and he inspires me, but uh like I,
Well,
I
I think that he knew at a young age, quite a young age, that he had an extraordinary effect on people. And I think as he realized it and probably tried to veil it in some ways or to shield others from that power, I think he must also have realized that he couldn't, that probably a lot of crazy stuff was going to take place around him as under his influence, right? That he would set people on fire in a certain way. He would set hearts on fire, and that he couldn't really avoid doing that. He could, to an extent. I don't mean he couldn't exercise restraint, discretion, but that would be the fate of such a person, right? It is. I think it's just the case that there are great ones among us who do that, and so yeah, I think that was very real, and also certainly it enabled him probably to burn bridges more fearlessly than others might care to burn bridges. Yes, no question about it. And yet, they were. And this was a man who came from a great house in Vienna. That there's a certain confidence that goes with an upbringing of that kind, which is shared by those who have grown up in insecure circumstances. But I think, nevertheless, that he did burn bridges without knowing how he was going to get back across the river, or if he was going to get back across the river. So yes, no question, he was an exceptional person. And
so from that place, how did he relate to people he was connected to who didn't necessarily burn bridges or follow him across the bridge that then he burned?
Well, I think with great charity would be my short answer in the years I knew him. Now, if you read Todd Hart's book, which deals essentially with the 60s, you can detect elements of asperity, of pride, of realpolitik also. Perhaps he didn't deal very fairly with John Considine, who was on his board and who was the one who had cooked up or at least urged on various popes this mission to Latin America. He was playing Considine in a certain way, right? He was, in that sense, behaving politically, knew he was behaving politically, and stepped on toes. But I, in the years I knew him, I felt like he was taking care of a lot of people. And although he was avid for the conversation of his intellectual peers and sought it, he's very happy to. He also had not a few lame ducks in his company whom he cared for and cherished. So I think he felt that there, as with me, there could be a moment of seeing in which a kind of loyalty was enjoined, obedience, and I think he stuck to that pretty faithfully. But you can't live in the world and accomplish as much as he accomplished without elements of ruthlessness, elements of planning, right? And so.
David, this doesn't arise at all, just from the conversation, it doesn't arise at all from the readings that we've just done. And maybe it's a question at some future point. But I wonder in your mind, if you think of Illich, who was so unusually unique, one might say, who would come to mind, past or present, who might be that kind of person in the historical past or present? Is there someone that might come to mind to you?
With Savonarola, he was a hero of Ivan's in his youth and in Florence, but he looked like him. There are profiles of Savonarola which are astonishingly like Ivan. So that's one. I'm sure you could think of many others but that's the one that comes to mind for me. Yeah.
I'm realizing that we're close to
Oh yeah.
30 here. So I want to express our gratitude again for the book, for the conversation, and I think for also, I would dare say, maybe a growing sense of fellowship in this little circle here, where there's some space to carry not only a curiosity and an affection for Illich, but I think some of our own existential questions that we maybe don't find. At least I'll speak for myself, that I don't necessarily find other spaces to have a kind of a sympathetic like in this circle. So grateful for all of that. Does anyone feel me? Yeah,
I'll just interrupt
Wayne.
for a second. I think I missed just the crucial thing you were saying just a moment ago, because your voice became distorted. Did anyone else experience it?
Yeah.
So
I lost
sorry.
it for a minute.
remember, it was just a little bit that we missed, but it was crucial to what you were saying. And I'm trying to think, you follow it through by in this space or something. I'm sorry, I've lost the moment. I tried to say it, but I was muted. So don't worry.
Oh,
Don't worry.
sorry,
We got
folks.
we got the gist of it for sure, I think.
Yeah, gratitude for this circle as a space to carry some of the questions of our minds and hearts, as one of the things we're grateful for, besides of David's time and the book and Illich's legacy. I'm casting about for a way to close this circle. I don't know if anyone else has an inspiration for. I think you brought a lovely quote to kind of send us off with, Wayne, last time, and I haven't come so prepared. Well, I'll just. I mean, the image for me with Illich that is maybe uh, dearest and brightest is the image of that candle.
Yeah.
That stub of a candle that he carried, as I understand, in his pocket everywhere he went, and would pull out where two or three were gathered, as a reminder of the one who is, maybe to steal the Jaber Crow image, present and completely present in ways that are not at all vague, but as soon as we try to grasp and nail that presence down, then it eludes us. So I recognize that light within each one of you, and I'm grateful, and grateful for the mystery from the beyond, from which that light comes. So thanks everyone for this time, and we'll meet again on the last Tuesday of November.
And that will be the
and
last
we'll do another
time.
3 chapters. Is that right?
I don't know. Is that right? 3 chapters? 3 more chapters? Okay.
So that would be Deschooling Society, Disabling Professions and Certainties.
So are we talking the 30th, Marcus, I believe?
Oh, I haven't looked.
I remember there was some debate about the 4th Tuesday or the last Tuesday, and we landed on the last Tuesday, and I think this is the month in which that is relevant.
This coming, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, this coming month.
So November 30th then, in chapters 4 to 7.
Yes.
And I think, David, always, if from the past, anything you want to draw on, either a question that you got or so on, I don't think we have to just limit it to the next set of chapters.
Yeah, and we haven't really, have we?
No. And the only other thing I would say, this will be the last one this year. And what we did, this little committee that planned it, said we'll do one in January, and in a way, put it to everyone, but in particular to you, David. Is this working for you? Because the demands are greatest on you.
I'm not sure that's true. No, it's fine. It's fine. I'm happy to be with you. I want to talk about these things. I want to find out what's on people's minds. So it's very welcome to me to know how people read this book.
Okay, wonderful.
So
thank you.
And I know there's a lot of questions here I see I didn't really answer, but I've got this list, and maybe next time some of them will come up. So, and maybe some are being answered implicitly. For example, Larry had asked what I was trying to do with the book. Was I trying to preserve Illich's ideas, his legacy, or his presence? So maybe some of that is enacted in the conversation. All 3, evidently, but certainly the presence is great, but as Marcus said, also perhaps is also a mutual presence that we enjoy. And that, Marcus, just a final thought in relation to what you said. I think I think a time of witnessing is coming. And I wouldn't have said that before March of 2020, and I probably wouldn't have said it right away after that either. But pretty soon I began to realize that a major transformation was underway, however it was made to come to pass, and that it will be a time of witness. And that, I think, is relevant to what you asked also. So farewell all, and we'll see you in a month.
All right.
Thank you,
Okay,
David.
Care.
thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
See you,
bye
everybody.
you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.